Hello, everyone. Welcome to this session of Meet the Members of Empower Africa. My name is Shai Bernstein. I'm excited and honored to host a terrific podcast. My name is Shai Bernstein. Like I said, I'm VP of Business Development and Partnerships at Empower Africa, and we have this session once a week, every Tuesday at 4 p.m. CAT, Central Africa time. Before I present our distinguished guest, for those of you who are joining us for the first time, Empower Africa is a business community with a mission to drive investment, trade, and job creation in Africa. We believe in trade over aid and that business is the best way to build things and make a difference. We have three verticals in the company. The first is the Empower Africa Business Network. The second are events and trade missions. And the third are consulting and project facilitation. We believe in bringing good people together. We believe in the power of synergy. And that's why our business community is invite-only and paid membership to make sure that the people who are joining our community are straight, honest people who can add tremendous value to each other. Our goal is very simplified: to create connections, optimize the communication between the different investors, entrepreneurs, banks, governments, you name it, and of course, maximize the collaboration that can be done. Speaking of bringing good people together, it is my pleasure and honor to welcome today Jonathan Machado, senior investor at Samsung Next. I would like to just clarify and, a disclaimer that we know each other for quite many years. I'm embarrassed to say how many years, I think. In addition to what he's doing now in Samsung Next, Jonathan has a tremendous track record. He'll tell us a little bit about it in a few moments. And every time we speak about business, about different investments or entrepreneurships, I always find his insights to be tremendous. So please, Jonathan Machado, welcome. Please tell us about yourself.
Yeah, so thanks for having me. And I was wondering, with this kind of intro of having good people around, what am I doing here? But I guess now you're stuck with me for the hour, so we'll have to deal with that. Super excited to be here. I've been following, of course, what you, Shai, and Empower Africa has been doing the past couple of years and how you've grown. So very big fan. That's worth saying. And I love the trade over aid. I don't know if you guys kind of trademark that, but it sounds great, man. I like it. I like it a lot.
Yeah.
Trade over aid. I'm going to use it for some random context, just so I can say the phrase at some point in my next few meetings. When I find an excuse,
just make sure that you say afterwards Empower Africa, because it is our.
Yeah, for sure. Even if I'm talking about something else, I'm just going to find a reason to say that. But in any case, yeah. So like you've mentioned, we've known each other for too long by now. It's surprising we still like each other. So I don't know what we're doing right or wrong, but anyway. Born and raised in Jerusalem, Israel, to actually a French immigrants, so the way we call them in Israel, Olim, so Jews who moved from France back in the day. Grew up as a modern Orthodox kid in the streets of Jerusalem, and then did like the regular Israeli path through the army. And funnily enough, when I joined university, my goal was to finish university. So I think something that's interesting about the Israeli market, and I think in many ways, and we can talk about it a bit later, I'm not comparing where Israel is now to where some probably African countries are now. But if you look, back at the day when you and I were going to school, and of course when we were like the years we grew up as kids, there's no high tech back in the early 90s, no natural resources, surrounded by enemies, so no trade, happening in Israel, so there's no kind of a big local market, and so in many ways, from a perception point of view, you choose your degree. There's, I would imagine, some of the kind of similar point of view that potentially people from places that are not the UK or America come from, which is like necessity. I'm getting this degree because I want to get stuff done.
Right.
I want to go into business. It's not like I'm looking for like an experience to grow, to very practical. Right. So I choose this degree that was combining two degrees, an MBA and a law degree, which in Israel you can go straight out of the army into a law degree without the need to go through like a regular BA first. And really I managed to crunch those 2 degrees that typically take about 6 or 7 years in about 4.5 years, including my kind of required internship to graduate as a lawyer after the bar. But then the goal was, again, never to be a lawyer. The point was, let's acquire some tools. Let's get those 2 lines on the CV, and kind of do one of 3 things in my mind. And right, going back to my naive self of like 10 or whatever it was, 12 years ago, 15 years ago, I was thinking investment banking, consulting, or VC. Did I know anything about what those things actually meant back in the day? Probably not. But at least I've read enough to realize that these would be great real world schools, right? Places that, they actually pay, which is great. But you come out of it with the kind of the real MBA under your belt.
Right.
And so that kind of was the thinking. And in my last couple of months in the MBA, I took part of this kind of immersion program in San Diego and the Valley, where I was exposed to the innovation in the VC world, and that's when I kind of fell in love with this domain. I came back, and actually, that's a cute Jewish story, right? About you kind of plan a career, you go to school, you take the SATs, you this, that, you get your GPA,
right,
and then you come back from a trip and you share a Shabbat meal, a Saturday afternoon meal with friends, just to find out that a friend of yours works in this VC called JVP, who quit a month later, recommended me, and the rest is kind of history.
Right.
But I guess going back to the networking piece and how actually in this case religion or friends kind of come together could actually yield some cool opportunities. So that's kind of a very far background. Then I spent 5 years in this pretty large local fund called JVP, Jerusalem Venture Partners. I did I think, at least back in the day, less traditional track of becoming in Israel like a professional investor. So climbing the ranks internally, doing the analyst, associate, principal, and eventually made partner in kind of the junior, the early stage vehicles of that specific fund. And after 5 years there, I was approached by Samsung Next, which I think we'll discuss a bit more in length today, where I've been the past 3 years and where I lead our healthcare investments globally. That's kind of in a short, 30 something years of
wow.
Let's pretend it's less than 30, right? Let's pretend it's longer.
Yeah, no, but it's really I find it so it's fascinating to look back and look at the journey that we've all done, each one from his own place. Certain things, like you mentioned, that you have a perception of it, or you think you know something about it, and then you kind of get your feet wet and start working on it and see a whole new world. And it's funny you mentioned the trade over aid, because that's something that's really kind of our goal. And that when we coined that term, it stems from the belief that it's not, you have to make sure that things are sustainable. And even when you have certain aspects of philanthropy, and ones we're sharing are these stories of growing up in Jerusalem, right? So I remember growing up volunteering when I was about 15 in a fantastic organization called Good Neighbor. We're essentially just taking, supermarket carts, and people, while they're doing their shopping for the weekend, drop off some rice, chicken, or canola oil, right? And we then distribute these boxes of the most, basic foods, like I mentioned, some oil, some rice, and pasta, and just giving it to these families before the weekend. And I remember I did it for a couple of years every Friday, and it was wonderful. And as I grew older, I was 16, 17, it started bugging me a bit that some of these families, that their refrigerators are empty, they still may have flashy watches or flashy cars even. And back in the day, flat screen TVs, which, if you remember back in the day, that was a big deal. We didn't have at home a flat screen TV. And I would walk into some of these homes and I'd be like, so that's when I kind of evolved and learned about Pa'amonim, which is in Hebrew translates to bells or bells of freedom, which takes a very different approach that helps families who are in debt reach financial stability. So that's much more in-depth. You have different experts from different domains that are helping you as the volunteer with this family, and you meet with them every week or two for a whole year. And that's when it really kind of started to ignite in my mind and in my soul the concept of how we utilize business, because that was kind of a passionate thing on the side, right? Simultaneously, I'm working in business, right? I'm in the international business community in the Israeli high-tech ecosystem, but all the time, because I was Pa'amonim for about 8 years, and also was at their board and doing a lot of opening the branch in Rezilion and so on. It has to be sustainable. And why am I saying this? Because Empower Africa has a mission to drive investment, trade, and job creation in Africa. And I think that you, as someone who knows the business side, especially from the entrepreneurship VC perspective, cold, I think it's extremely valuable to hear insights, right? And a lot of our, members and people who listen to our podcast and come to our events are entrepreneurs in very different, sectors. Our main focus right now is agriculture, so the whole agriculture ecosystem, as you know. So that includes, though, the full value chain of ag tech, food tech, farmers and growers, import, export, food processing, the investors, the governments, right? It's a whole ecosystem. And Africa, of course, has a very big role here. I know that Samsung Next at the moment, Africa is not, on the top of your list. You have specific regions, that you're focusing on for various reasons. In other words, yet, right? Africa soon will be going up higher. But I think really one of the biggest missions that we feel in Empower Africa is really to enhance more positive awareness about Africa. And when I say that, what I'm referring to is, again, from a business perspective, it's about the business, right? And most, of my friends from New York, London, the Valley, Tel Aviv, many of them incredibly smart and fantastic people, still view Africa as a country instead of a continent with 54 countries. And so besides the numbers and the stats of 1.3 billion people, and that 60% of the population is under the age of 25, right? Still, there's just so much untapped potential, business potential, to drive investment, trade, and job creation in Africa. So that's kind of the angle with Africa on that end. And I think that it would be very interesting to hear from you, and then I'll stop talking because, we want to hear you talk. There are a lot of African-based corporates who are growing, whether it's specific businesses that are growing tremendously, also through VCs. We even have a couple of unicorns on continent. They're different corporates, and a lot of them are seeing how technology is changing rapidly, and you have to get a ventures arm. You have to look for different technology that fits my business, right? Whichever business it is. So love to hear some of your insights on, what does a corporate arm look like in such a, huge one, of course, as Samsung, and your thoughts.
So actually, just before I dive into that, I think what I think there's areas where we can kind of use the human behavior to also learn about the corporate behavior, right? Like what drives a person, how does a person kind of thinks about a risk and opportunity. If you think of the opportunity and the risks that going into business into that continent called Africa with 54 countries that represents. And I just go back to this step in my career of going after this VC world. I actually never planned to become a professional investor. And the plan was, let's do this for 2 or 3 years, like be an analyst associate, learn from other people's mistakes, right? So, what this kind of hints to is, there's already learnings, there's already many people doing it. It's like an ecosystem, like you mentioned. Once I do that and I do it on someone else's dime, then I'll try to build my own company and kind of do it myself. The thing is, and I think that's in that respect, corporates and VCs are not very different than the way kind of I approach that specific step in my career. They see, okay, there's this opportunity or risk. Let's see what everybody else is doing. Let's see all the success stories, right? And I think success stories is key when you want to form an innovation kind of culture and an ecosystem and kind of these perfect storms that yields all those amazing benefits that we can see in Tel Aviv, in the Valley, and in other right. kind of tech hubs. And so it kind of becomes a chicken and egg, because we can all understand that if everything was going great in many right. of these countries, and if you had the unicorns appearing every other week, on the newspaper, and IPOs and this and that, and ton of venture money pouring in, and of course, if the geopolitical situation was better and COVID wasn't around and all these things, then you wouldn't need me here today or anybody really to tell you why and how to do it. It would just be happening. And I think it kind of goes back, and again, just before I talk into the Samsung piece, I don't know if you covered this on your previous episodes here, about that the beginning. How do you actually initiate that? And I think it really relates to what Empower Africa is trying to do, is to kind of be one of those catalyzers that just like, takes something from no and connects people and creates out of, I don't want to say out of nothing. We should, there is one God, the way I see things, but at least, try to create or do the 1 + 1 = 5 and really start building this kind of a relationship that yields value creation, that yields innovation, that yields trade and business and so forth. And I think if we just learn for a second from the story of Israel, and I think in this respect, what's interesting, by the way, Korea, where Samsung is naturally out of, in Israel, if you go back to the 1960s, right, to the Korea War and that kind of era, Korea was the second poorest country in the world.
Wow.
Okay, South Korea in 62 is the Cuba, whatever, 53. In 1953, right. After the Korean War, South Korea was the second poorest country in the world. So parallel to Afghanistan today. Okay, that's where Korea was. Today, Korea is one of the, I think, 12 or 14th largest economies in the world. And so actually the founders of Samsung, if you go that far back, they actually came out of a very similar kind of necessity reality, and not a luxurious reality. And so I think until today, many things and ways in which Samsung operates really resembles a world where, no, you don't have a plan B. There is no option to fail. You can't just, like I think potentially many people who are based in the US kind of fall back to a 7-digit salary or very nice
right.
6-digit salary in Google or wherever it is. It's kind of, do or die, or whatever the right expression is, right? And it's almost literally speaking, right? And so Israel, in that respect, coming out of decades of war, shows up in the 90s, and the Israeli government says, hey, we can trust the market to do whatever they want to do, but if we kind of give this extra push, this extra nudge with the Yozma project, Yozma translates for initiative, and kind of fund or de-risk effectively, going back to what I was saying about opportunities and risks, de-risk the foundation of the first 10 VCs out of Israel, maybe with this artificial push, we can kind of let the market do something it would have taken longer or never to do. And so by saying on every $12 million a VC raise, we'll match 8, right, in a no risk loan kind of a thing, they bootstrap the Israeli VC industry. And it's easy at 2021 to say, and the rest is history, because it's been hundreds right. and thousands of people who worked really hard to make what our ecosystem became. But I think guys, the first lesson out of it, and I think it's a good lesson from the Empower Africa side, is saying, no, we can't just expect things to happen. Things don't just happen. And I'm not, the history professor to go back to how Silicon Valley was created, but from what I kind of vaguely remember, there was a lot of government intervention there as well, with subsidies and tax cuts and whatnot, to allow, the Silicon Valley to become, in its very first day what it is today. So it's very easy to forget that today, right? And to say, oh, if I'm an American kind of, a free market person, and say, forget about it. We don't need government intervention. We don't need those third parties who kind of, market makers like Empower Africa. Look, it's working just fine without it. The matter of the fact is, at the beginning, it was very much a necessity. The second kind of lesson I take out of this is kind of innovation out of necessity versus innovation out of luxury. Right. So I think when we think of the next thing that's gonna, the next innovation that's going to come out of the States or China for that matter, I mean, I think many of us think of the biggest companies who came out of recently, and if it's TikTok on one side and Snapchat on the other side, I mean, don't get me wrong, this is very cool. I wish I was an investor in one of these companies early on. But if we're honest with ourselves, while we would love to trade our bank accounts with the, the bank accounts of the CEOs and investors, it's not something your Jewish mama is proud of you the next day to say, hey, my son allows people to say naked pictures to his friends, kind of a thing. So, but when I think of what kind of innovation I expect to come out of Africa, right, of African countries, I can't imagine a Snapchat coming out of Nigeria. I can definitely imagine the most advanced kind of watering system or agri-tech company or solar energy. And in that respect, and I'm getting to the Samsung point in a second, but in that respect, I think what's interesting about where we are today from technological history perspective,
right,
is that I think many countries that are not as well off as many of the Western countries
right,
could get the feeling, or people in those countries could get the feeling of like, oh wow, we're so far behind. What we need to do in order to innovate in 2021, we need to make up for decades of lost time. But in reality, the cost of starting, so if you go back 10 years ago, if you wanted to build a startup, great, you had to buy the storage and have a server in your basement and all these expensive, long and hard process to do. But today, opening an account on Amazon through your mobile, and you have a server running in no time. And so actually, in a way, by kind of not being present in those forming decades of the past 20, 30 years, there is no better point in history to say, hey,
right.
I want to buy a ticket to this train. Now is actually a good time to say that versus maybe 10 years ago, because now the barrier is so much lower. And so with much lower effort, you can build a computer vision system detecting plants and whatnot, for in agriculture, chips are, cheaper than ever and so forth. And so suddenly, there's a way to kind of cheat in a way and say, hey, I want to skip the desktop revolution, the laptop revolution. I'm just joining right away for the serverless, decentralized revolution. And so that's actually what I think is the promising piece of the whole story.
Yeah, and on that end, I'll just add that's the leapfrog, as people call it, right? It happened multiple times in developing countries, and especially in Africa. So whether it's the landline, right? They just jumped the cell phones. And you have today so many people with smartphones, and the internet coverage is getting, larger and larger by the day. And so suddenly you're, the whole concept of payment, right? Paying through your cell phone has been going on there way before it has been in many other countries. And of course, there are many African companies who are actually Flutterwave, by the way, to mention one of the last unicorns. Anyways, fintech aspect is very, So, and I mean, in terms of,
and so, go ahead. I would just was going to say, I mean, I think the chat. So I think let's address, I guess, two corporate just before we go to the next question. I think there's corporates that are already present in Africa. They're either targeting the African market. So Samsung is present in Africa, right? We sell phones, I think, in every single country around the world. I'm pretty sure. But from a VC innovation perspective, R&D centers, right? The issue, I think, any country in the world faces, that's true for Israel as well, by the way, when it needs to convince, quote unquote, an Intel-like, a Qualcomm-like, a Samsung-like to open the R&D center, to shift innovation dollars to this country, is that it's really an alternative question, right? When you are that CTO of this, you go up all the way up the food chain, and you got to make a few $billions of decisions. You have India on one side, China, Israel, America. Right. There's all these, and sometimes think of the environment around the Trump administration with try to focus on bringing business back to America and factories back to America. Like, you're facing so many kind of challenges, and I think for the most part, there's many things you can control. But, and I think it's something that the government of Israel has done well, is to create this kind of subsidies and tax breaks and whatever it is to make it the friendliest environment possible for these corporates, almost make it a no-brainer, right? Because the reality is, and that's something people forget about this innovation ecosystem, you have that engineer that works at Intel, but around him you have the dentist and the supermarket and the whole economy that's created around people who need those services. And so actually it's a multiplying effect where countries typically have a benefit. Now, from a Samsung perspective, I would say the following: from a Samsung Next perspective, right? So what we are is an innovation group, a VC arm of a very large corporate. And even though the Samsung yearly revenue is about 2.5 times the size of the Israeli government budget, so it could be a small country or a large country of our own in a way. We still have limited resources. We still need to say, okay, we're gonna, where is the next best investment for the dollar, right? Where where's the next country we're going to come out of? And for sure, in that respect, you look at the unicorns number, you look at where innovation is coming from. And so I think for this family of corporates, you need to be feeling very, very strong about already maximize many other opportunities before you say, I'm going to open a new arm, a new office. And that's true not just for an African country. It's also true if we were looking to open shop in India or looking to open shop in China, where we don't have innovation or a VC arm of Samsung Next. And so when we think, Africa, it's not a standalone question. It's part of a bigger kind of set of parameters we take into consideration. But then we kind of get to the local corporates, which I think should lead the way and should pave the way for the corporates like ourselves, because they're already there. And so for them, it's real business. It's no joke. It's real money behind them. And happy to discuss more of that. What can we learn about, Samsung's move to a corporate who's already present in Africa? But, that's definitely how I would approach it. Right.
And if we're talking about, because I actually personally am just really interacting with many, many, many entrepreneurs throughout. And it's, of course, the larger, kind of entrepreneur ecosystems on continent right now are South Africa, Nigeria, Kenya, Rwanda, right? But there are ecosystems all over. And we actually have, a pitch event that I've actually discussed with you briefly about highlighting the top startups in Botswana as well. So, and as I'm meeting all these entrepreneurs, right, at the end of the day, they're different markets, it's different countries, there's a whole different culture. But at the end of the day, I feel like there still are your basic kind of rules, right, of how to build your company, how to make it scale, how to make it stick, how to make it work, right? If I'm an entrepreneur in Nigeria or Kenya right now, do you have any tips you could share when you're looking to invest in a company? Right?
No, so something I'm for sure, something I think you said, which is I think true, but at such a deep level, which I think is worth kind of paraphrasing. The fundamental of business are the fundamental of business, and they don't change. In the sense that if you have a business that's built around unit economics that do not scale, think of WeWork at a certain stage in their company life, it doesn't matter how much money you pour into the business, no matter what kind of brand you build around it, it's doomed to fail to some extent. And so that I think is true. And oftentimes I find entrepreneurs, and I think that's already one good tip. I was just talking about this with a colleague earlier today, a great dude from Intel Capital. We are both present in this kind of large Facebook group, and people keep asking questions about the how and not about the what. So let me explain. How long should be the presentation? How many slides? Doesn't matter if my English is not so great.
Right.
All these questions, which, listen, if that's the last thing you've left to figure out with your company,
you're set.
If really that's it, that's kind of the reason why you kind of reach out to a community of hundreds of people. I mean, dude, you're in a good place to be. Right, because this essentially, whether you have good or bad English, if you're pitching a bad company, it's gonna show. And if you have good or bad English, but you're pitching an awesome business, it's going to show. Right. And so while you should definitely work on your English and work on your presentation skills, this is and as I think obvious to anybody, this is not, should change your how you go about building your company, right? Yeah. This is not the reason why yes to build or not to build. Yeah, that's for sure. I think the key challenge, and I think again, if I look at the Israeli market as what we can learn from it, is access to capital, really. Historically speaking, this I don't know if you noticed this, but I think if you've been reading Israeli tech news for the past 2 years, at least 1 year for sure, it doesn't go 2 weeks by when you have a title of an article say, "We're moving from startup nation to scale up nation." And if I hear it one more time, I'm going to throw up in my mouth. But what happened? Did the Israeli entrepreneurs change dramatically? Is the vintage of the 80s better than the vintage of the 60s? I mean, what happened? Right. And I think what's obviously happened, at least one thing which is very easily to measure, you go back to 2011, when my previous fund, I wasn't there yet, raised the first opportunity fund, right? So the first fund raised by an early stage VC targeting their own portfolio companies to allow them to grow further and not to sell early, right? And a couple of their, I would say, three largest of JVP largest successes came out of companies that had, let's say, ClickTech is one example, and the CyberArk is another example,
right?
Where there were acquisition offers earlier in the company's life, right. And the ability to say no, and in CyberArk's case, say no plus here is the money to go forward, enabled what back in the day was one of the largest exits ever out of Israel, and actually, from a VC returns perspective, was the single best return by a VC in Israel at that point. And what happened following 2011 and over the course of the next decade is another VC raised an opportunity fund and another one. And growth funds, independently growth funds began to be raised. And then American VCs, growth VCs came to, and just like last week, it was announced that Blackstone opened shop in Israel.
Right.
I mean, one of the two largest private equity shops in the world.
Right.
And so suddenly that entrepreneur who's facing that few $100 million valuation or unicorn status, he's faced with options. He's saying, wait a minute, I like my chances. Right. No, thank you, Google. No, thank you, Intel. I want to go, go big, go bigger. But without the kind of ability, the inside partners of the world, and the GA and the Blackstones and the IGP and of the world, you can't scale those businesses. And so the one thing I would say as a kind of a very practical, lesson from a higher level discussion is the following. When you ask entrepreneurs what are you raising money for? Why you're raising money? What for? What do they say? To build a product. They say to hire people. And I tell them, no, you're raising money in order to be able to raise more money. And I know that's putting the VC in the center of things, and I'm not being a narcissistic here. But rather, I'm saying the following. If you think you're raising $2 million to hire people, and that's kind of your mindset, when the money ends, you're most likely not going to hit a milestone that is fundable and that the next level of VC is going to want to fund. And so historically speaking, I think depending period, number one and number two reason, or the second reason for a startup failure is no more cash, no more money in the bank. Go check it on CB Insights and look for the 2019, 2018, 2017 kind of. Yeah. And so what is that? It's just people who didn't raise enough money, who didn't manage the cash correctly. And so when the money was over and they were trying to fundraise before the money was over, they were meeting investors and saying, I'm sorry, between the point that you raised the previous fund to this time, there hasn't been enough progress that I'm convinced as a VC that, enough has been the risk for me to come and put more money into this company. And so I think especially in an ecosystem where capital is not as available as it is in Silicon Valley or in Tel Aviv,
right.
I think one thing that one should be really, really mindful is that fundable milestone. What is that you're going to achieve soon enough, early enough before the funds are over, that would now give you enough time to go and fundraise, and that next level of investors in the stream are going to say, yes, this milestone is significant enough for me to come in with the next check that you need to keep scaling your company.
Right. Yeah, that's. I think that's very true. I'd argue that half the companies in Israel also don't know that or don't view it that way. For sure. You go. My typically the last question I ask in most of my kind of encounters with startup, and I say, okay, how much money are you raising? Okay, $10 million, let's say, and then I ask the following question: give me a snapshot of the company at the end of those $10 million. So let's assume you're not raising money and you're just running, full, steam, against a brick wall or against like a, I don't know, body or whatever it is. Yeah. Give me a snapshot of the company the day before it dies because of no cash. How many employees do you have? How many, how much revenue ARR do you have? How many customers do you have? Which kind of customers are they, and so forth. And so when the entrepreneur answers, sometimes I'm like, oh, wow, that's ambitious. If we can get from $1 to $6 million in ARR in 18 months, it's going to grow the company from 10 employees to 16. It's going to do, if I believe into this vision and this team and this, operational plan, no doubt they're going to get funded again. But sometimes I get this answer and I'm like,
wait a minute, you're telling me you're raising $20 million and this is what you think is going to be kind of the status in 2 years? This is not interesting enough. Nobody's going to want to fund it. So like, even if I want to believe you, so I'm saying without any critical view as a VC and no poking into your models and not like being more conservative, what you are presenting is not interesting enough to be funded.
Right. Yeah. I also think that on that note, I think sometimes we maybe just get confused with the bells and whistles. And I think it happens a lot of times in life to many of us in different, wherever we are. But like at the end of the day, it's where you're going, right? And I think that taps into what you're saying. Where are you going? So it's not just where you want to be in 5 years, but you now are asking for $10 million. Great. What do you plan to do with it? And more importantly, not just what do you plan to do with it tomorrow or in a month, but rather where will you be once that 10 million run out? And I think that that is something that is very fundamental also with, like we're saying about the basic, the common sense of the business, that again, it doesn't matter how good your English is, but rather show me the numbers, right? Like what's the traction that we're talking about? The value, right? The value that your product is providing from like, the keep it simple, stupid type of approach, right? Like, let's forget everything for a minute. Talk to me. Like, I think that
actually, I think you're raising another great point. I mean, two points actually, I think, which I really like. The first one is, we have this kind of famous saying in Hebrew, know where you came from, know where you came from and where you're going to, right? And I think that's the one thing that's missing on the present side is you ask people, whatever funny name people come up with is ridiculous name for companies these days. But
right.
I think like whatever free domain there is, like, great, it's not taken, let's take that name. But you get this like funny name company, and you're like, what do you do? And so they begin to explain it to you by saying, we are Uber for something. We are Wix for something else. We are, and then they go on a rant of like 5 different buzzwords that you're like, but actually, what do you do? And for me, we get tons of decks and of investor presentations, and you skim through, and sometimes I'm like, I don't know, I'm like 2 minutes into this thing, and I just have no clue what this company is doing. So like, big stats and like a Jeff Bezos quote and like this and that and like the market is growing and then and therefore and like, but I'm like, at slide number 8 and I still have no clue what you're doing. Even when I get to that slide where supposedly the solution is explained, is like, what are you doing? I just actually have, and so I think this kind of I think going back to this, what you were just saying, is connects to me to what you were saying about know where you're going to in a kind of very visualized way. I think great entrepreneurs have an ability to visualize a future that most of us can't kind of visualize in that level of clarity. Because when you're building a startup, you're building a company not for the present, because it's only going to become a significant company 3, 4, 5, more likely 7 or 10 years from now. And so you need to be able to say, okay, this is where the cloud world is today. This is where the agri-tech world is today. This is where, think of Elon Musk, right? He was not the first one to try to build this kind of electric car infrastructure play, end to end. But I think his ability to, at day one, really understand what are things going to look like 5 years, 10 years from now, and then work backwards from an operational perspective and actually build it. So when everybody else says, hey, you dude, you're crazy, he might actually be crazy, but crazy right also. And so I think it's not about the charisma, right? But I think there is something about when you meet those entrepreneurs, and for that I don't have a good tip, but more like this feeling maybe that entrepreneurs get inside when you have this clarity. It's a form when you hear the entrepreneurs and know what they're doing and know what they're doing it for and how it's going to look like, you get this kind of clear clarity of how the world and what is going to look like and why they're going to win. And that's when you're kind of willing to subscribe to this journey, knowing it's going to change 5 times in the process, knowing it's going to be a roller coaster, knowing that nobody has, only easy. Because when this visualization is communicated to us on the investor community side, that's kind of when we say, yes, I want to buy a ticket to this train.
Right. 100%. Jonathan, thank you so much for joining us. as I mentioned to you, I always like to end with like a certain quote or a saying. And I like to ask our guests to just kind of share a quote that they like, that they're inspired from, inspired by. I mean, you did give us, one very good quote just now about, know where you're coming from and know where you're going. If you have another saying or quote that resonates with you.
Yes. So yeah, first of all, I took one from you, so I might as well give one back, right? So I have this quote in my mind that I invented. I don't know if I did. So if I stole it from someone and it's been stuck in my head for 20 years, I apologize. But I'm going to go on record here saying that I think I invented this quote, and it goes like this: you can't burn a bridge that doesn't exist. Okay, now let's talk about it for a second. So many people say, I know this guy, but when it comes to the point in time to reach out, they're hesitant, right? They have a network, they have people they know, and they say, I don't want to burn bridges. I don't want to risk, hurting this relationship. And so what I think in the real world is that, when people have 10,000 connections on LinkedIn, really, 9,500 are not their bridges, they're not the real people. And so if you have someone in your network that you're debating whether to reach out or not, because you're afraid about it's going to burn the bridge or not, I say you can't burn a bridge that doesn't exist. If you're thinking too much about reaching out to them, they're either not in your network, there's no bridge there, right? And so if that's the case, just reach out and prove to yourself, is there a bridge there? Am I really connected to this person or not? Right. And so this should make you, as an entrepreneur who always needs to ask for help, and needs to ask to meet people, and needs to ask, for introductions to investors, to other entrepreneurs, to corporates. You can't burn a bridge that doesn't exist. Reach out, because if you think you have a connection, you're not reaching out, you actually don't have it.
Wow. Fantastic.
We
should coin it. We should coin it. Make sure that it's TM. That's great.
Let's do this.
All right, man. Great to see you. Great to speak to you. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me. Take care.
Bye-bye.